Hello, my name is Justin Dennis, and this is my CAP assignment on Gait development. So the first phase of Gait, we have basis support. So in early childhood, they use a wide basis support, and this allows for a little bit more stability rather than mobility. In childhood, they start to use a split stance of support, but also use a wide basis support at times. And then in adulthood, they use a split stance basis support, kind of like we're used to seeing with normal Gait. And then into adulthood, they use a split stance based support as well, but also sometimes use a wide base support for a little bit more stability. So then now into some theories, abnormalities, and constraints. According to our book, new walkers tend to optimize balance by widening their stance, which increases their base of support. So this is probably why we saw the younger child and older adult use the wide base of support. Some abnormalities were the wide base of support, and then the constraints. I found a constraint that would be that children have to be able to move their legs alternatively and have strong enough legs to support themselves on a single limb. So this is another reason why we saw the wide base of support rather than the split stance in early childhood. So the next phase is stride length. In early childhood, they exhibited out-toeing and a very small vertical stride length. And then into childhood, the child tended to walk flat-footed and sometimes even on our toes in a plantar flex position. And then in adulthood, they actually had an increased stride length and was very rhythmic and kind of like we're normally seeing in Gait, normal to seeing for Gait. And then into older adulthood, the stride length again was shorter. And she didn't pick up her legs off the ground at all. She kind of just shuffled them across the ground. So a theory that I found is a large component of stride length is derived from pelvic rotation and to hip rotation as well. And so probably another reason why we didn't see very large stride length in the younger population was they just didn't have the muscle coordination and muscle ability to use their torso and their pelvic region to allow for rotation and increase stride length. So one of the abnormalities I did find, leg length actually has a lot of is a large factor to stride length as well. So that could be another kind of reason that we didn't see large stride length in the older population or the younger population as well. And so that constraint was the musculoskeletal region and the leg length for the younger children. So the next phase of Gait would be arm swing. The toddler had elevated arms and didn't move them really at all. And then in the childhood video, the child's arms were very static. When she did move her arms, they elevated in a jerky movement, so it wasn't very coordinated. And then in the adult, we had a smooth, continuous arm swing, and it was oppositional arm swing, so opposite arm, opposite leg, like we're used to seeing in Gait. And then into older adulthood, the arm swing was actually only present in the right arm, and it was very, very minimal. And then in the left arm was very static and didn't move at all. Excuse me. So one of the theories for this, a study I found with arm swing is within walking conditions, significant difference of gait velocity, stride length, cadence, and double limb support was a factor of arm swing. So this is another reason why we could see kind of the stride length and speed of gait being affected as well. The younger children were very slow in their gait. And then so for the abnormality in our book, they were talking about a child developing through Gait, and her hands and arms are carried in a high and bent position. All these characteristics of early walking lead to balance for new walkers. So this is why we didn't see any arm swing in the younger childhood. So some constraint that I thought would be brain development is not advanced enough in early childhood to coordinate the oppositional arm swing like we see in the adult. So then for the initial contact and loading response, in the early childhood, the toddler exhibited out-toeing and did not have a heel-to-toe response. And then in the childhood video, the child occasionally uses a heel-to-toe action, but also walked in a plantar flex position a lot of the time. So her toes, she was walking on her toes a lot. And then in the adult video, they did display a heel-to-toe action during initial contact, and then in the loading response, their plant leg was in a slightly flexed position. And then the older adult, the heel-to-toe action was not present. As I mentioned, the older adult walked very flat-footed and just kind of slid her feet across the ground. And then in the loading response, her plant leg was very minimally flexed, as were the rest of the videos. So a theory that I came up with, I hypothesized that the heel-to-toe action is only for the most advanced walkers, and so that's why in the early childhood, and older adult, we do not see, they don't have the musculoskeletal coordination to effectively implement the heel-to-toe action. That's why we didn't see it in their gait videos. An abnormality that I noticed was the toddler exhibited out-toeing, and then the child initiated contact with the ground in a plantar flex position a lot of the time, which I thought was interesting. And then the older adult just slid her feet across the ground, so she didn't even pick up her feet at all. So one of the constraints that I found for this is the planting of the foot flat on the ground changes to a heel-to-toe forefront, which results from an increased range of motion. So the more range of motion we have, the more advanced walker we become. Then that's when we start displaying the heel-to-toe action, like the most advanced walker being the adult. So then on into mid-stance. In early childhood, we see that the toddler's plant leg is in an extended position. However, the elevated leg is raised out in front of her body. The hip is in a flexed position, so her entire leg is out in front of her body. And then in childhood, we see that the child's plant leg is in an extended position. The elevated leg of the child is in a flexed position, but movement isn't very smooth or fluid. And then in the adulthood video, we see that the adult's plant leg is in an extended position to give them support, and the elevated leg is in a flexed position in the midline of their body, like we're used to seeing with gait. So the elevated leg is in the midline of their body, and it's not out in front like the early childhood. And then for the older adult video, we see that the plant leg is extended and the elevated leg is slightly bent out in front of their body, almost like the early childhood video. So one of the theories that I found related to mid-stance is the pelvis rotation actually allows a full range of motion for an oppositional movement of the upper and lower body segments. So what I found was really interesting with this is the pelvis is kind of contributing to that hip flexion. One of the reasons that this is kind of an interesting theory to me is so the hip flexion out in front of their body could be because the younger child and the older adult don't have a very good range of motion, and so they're kind of trying to compensate here. One of the abnormalities I saw was definitely the hip flexion out in front of their body instead of in the midline of their body. And a constraint for this in mid-stance, so this is the single leg limb support. It's the initial period of single leg support. So the older adult and younger child, they probably don't have the musculoskeletal support and strength to support themselves just on one leg. So they have to use that hip range of motion to get that leg out in front of their body as fast and as quick as possible, rather than taking their leg through a full swing. And then in terminal stance in the early childhood, there was not a heel-to-toe action in early childhood, so the terminal stance was very choppy. The child picked one foot up almost vertical and then put it right back on the ground. And then in the childhood, the plant leg was in a flexed position and the elevated leg was moving forward. And then the swing leg of the child initiated contact with the ground in a plantar flexed or flat position. In the adult video, we saw that the plant leg is in a completely flexed position and the elevated leg is moving forward and down to the ground. The heel of the plant leg started to elevate while the heel of the swing leg initiated contact with the ground in a dorsiflexed position. Different than the adult and the child was the dorsiflexed and plantar flexed position. And then finally in the adult, the plant leg was in a slightly flexed position as the leg swings and slides forward, sliding on the ground. So one of the theories that I thought of for this could be arthritis, could be contributing to the limited range of motion for the older adult. An abnormality was definitely the minimal flexion and extension in the older adult's plant and swing legs. There wasn't much flexion and extension throughout the video of Gait. Some constraints I found: gait modification is tend to be used as a non-surgical approach to reduce the external knee adduction force in patients with knee osteoarthritis. So in the older adult population, a lot of arthritis is present. So um, just kind of gait modifications like not using as much flexion and extension could be a large contributor and a more efficient way to perform gait if older individual does have osteoarthritis or any form of arthritis. So then in the pre-swing and initial swing, in early childhood, the initial swing was not present as the steps were sort of in a vertical motion and no dorsiflexion or plantar flexion occurred. In the childhood video, the child exhibited a raised leg with a plantar flex foot. The child's initial swing leg also made complete contact with the ground in a slightly flexed position. The adult's initial plant leg was elevated off the ground, and the heel is completely raised in the foot and is now in a plantar flex position. The initial swing leg has now made complete contact with the ground and is in a slightly flexed position now. In the older adult, the plant leg was slightly flexed. There's minimal flexion in the swing leg as the older adult prepared to slide her foot forward. So a theory that I kind of came up with, I hypothesized that the cartilage in the older adult's knee had broken down, and that's why there's minimal flexion and extension, kind of going back to the arthritis a little bit. And then the abnormality was definitely the adult just sliding her leg forward rather than more of a swing. One constraint that I found was knee pain. It was a common ailment that modifies gait characteristics. And so, again, with this adult, maybe they have knee pain or, had knee surgery or knee replacement. And so that's a reason why we're seeing some abnormalities and some constraint that can be a constraint. So for the initial swing and mid-swing, we see that in early childhood, there's slight forward movement of the swinging leg in a flexed position. And then in childhood, the initial plant leg is in a flexed position, but is only slightly flexed, and the child's foot alternates between dorsiflexion and plantar flexion. And the adult's leg is in a flexed position and is moving in a forward motion while the foot is dorsiflexed. And then in the older adulthood, there's very minimal flexion, and dorsiflexion of the foot is not present. So for a theory, I hypothesize that the older adult and younger child have slower gait speed to allow for a larger hip range of motion, so it's not as natural anymore. So they have to walk in a slower manner to allow for that hip to develop through whatever range of motion it's going to. For an abnormality, the older adult and young child do not have continuous smooth gait. The gait is very choppy and does not follow a consistent pattern. Again, going back to kind of knee pain and slower gaits can allow for a little bit more hip range of motion. Like I said, I hypothesize that this is for the older adult and younger child to take their hip through a range of motion that they're not able to naturally do anymore. And then in late mid-swing and terminal swing, the early childhood displays slight hip flexion and full extension of the knee, but no dorsiflexion is present. In the childhood, the child's hip begins to flex and her knee begins to extend. However, the child's foot is inconsistent and alternates between periods of dorsiflexion and plantar flexion. And the adult's hip begins to flex while the knee begins to extend. The heel approaches the ground and the foot is in a dorsiflexed position. In the older adult, there is minimal hip flexion. The swing leg reaches an extended position right before contact with the ground. No dorsiflexion is present as the older adult just slides her feet. And for theories, proprioception training is effective in reducing knee hyperextension and dorsiflexion. So the more that we practice proprioception and dorsiflexion, the more range and more consistent this is going to become. So for abnormalities, the child alternates between foot dorsiflexion and plantar flexion. What we're able to see here is with more proprioception training, the child may develop a more consistent gait pattern. Some constraints: the child does not have the proprioception awareness to know when and how to dorsiflex or plantar flex. And the more that we help that and more that we practice that, the better it's going to be. So these are my references, my first 4, and then my last 4. Thank you very much. Have a great day.